Hello, this is SR Staley, and I'm talking to you from a beautiful sunny morning in Bellbrook, Ohio. Today I want to talk about violence and aggression in children's literature. In particular, I want to ask the question, is violence necessary in children's literature? And if you think about it, there's an awful lot of violence. And in fact, my story, so Warrior Soul, which is a martial arts-oriented theme story, as well as The Pirate of Panther Bay and the Panther Bay series, which is set the pirates in the 18th century, it's obviously revolve around violence, and they're very important. The question is it necessary? It's important for understanding that in the Harry Potter series, the key for is that he's fighting to the death with Voldemort. So he's the Dark Lord. And it's not just Harry Potter. If you look at Brian Jakes, these are great stories of the Redwall series. We're talking about mainly animals, but they're always involved in fights. And we're also talking about the Chronicles of Narnia. I mean, these are all biblical in terms of the violence and the aggression that's part of it. These are actually some of those popular kid stories or children's books you're going to find on the planet. And actually, they're very good, too. So I've enjoyed reading them, and I encourage other people to read them, too. Now, The Hunger Games is a little different because while this is obviously very violent, what a lot of people don't recognize, it's really not until you get to, let me look here, it's actually page 148. You're almost halfway through the book before the Hunger Games actually begin. So it's all about anticipation. Said, why do our kids have to be exposed to this kind of violence? I mean, you turn on the TV, someone's being murdered. You pick up the newspaper, there are there's genocide in some country here or there, or you've got a government such as the Syrian government actually just involved in leveling entire towns of people that are protesting dictatorial rule. So why do we need this to be in our books and into our movies that really focus on children and young adults and teens? And this is actually something that I've given a lot of thought to, because I didn't want to just have a book that's just about violence. I'm actually as impatient as anyone with a video game or a movie where the violence is gratuitous. It doesn't serve any real purpose. And I think that's the difference. What is the purpose the violence serves to the story and to the character? And in the Hunger Games, you really can't have the story. You cannot have Katniss Everdeen character changing, or any of the values that she struggles with, whether it's loyalty to family, loyalty to herself, or self-preservation. You can't have that outside the context of the violence, the brutishness of the Hunger Games. Similarly, one of the things that I did have to do in A Warrior Soul, which is my most recent book, and which will be also in the next book, which is with the working title Renegade at this point, is that this is dealing with bullying and bullies. How do you escape violence when you're trying to deal with those really important social issues? Now, you could argue we could do Shakespeare, because most of the violence in Shakespeare's plays is completely off stage. In fact, even in Titus Andronicus, arguably one of the most violent plays ever written, there are dozens of people that are killed, including heads being served on plates. That violence occurs off stage. But here's where I think the difference is, particularly as it comes to children's literature, and why it's so important that the violence has to serve a purpose. The reality is kids are faced with violence on a day-to-day basis. In the case of bullying, this is real violence. They see it in the schools, they hear about it in the schools, they go on Facebook, they see that there are kids that are committing suicide because of the kind of violent behavior, whether it's verbal or physical, that is being perpetrated, not only on them, but also their kids. And it's very different from, say, the violence in a pirate book. To some extent, this is fantasy violence, because it's historical. We don't really have, except off the coast of Somalia and a few other places, and possibly in Asia, the kind of personal violence and the gruesomeness that comes along with the fights that are in the pirate books. But nevertheless, the violence is very real. And as an author, I believe that if we avoid violence in our stories, we're really doing a disservice to our readers. I mean, it's not just about the fact that the kids aren't going to read it, and in fact they won't. They'll find it boring. That's just a painful reality of the world in which our kids exist, and maybe one day it'll go away, but it's not going to go away for a very long time. But when we deal with violence as authors, we're dealing with a very important part of their reality. As an author, we need to use that violence, we need to use that aggression, we need to use that either physically or verbally as a way to further the story. And an important value of mine in all of my books, whether they're martial arts themes or pirates, is to ultimately show that violence is not the answer. In fact, I think even as brutal as the Hunger Games is, Suzanne Collins is very clear, at least in the interviews that I've read. I've not actually sat down and had coffee with her, but maybe one of these days that'll happen. But the essence of the Hunger Games is an anti-violence message. In other words, the violence is used by the Capital District to suppress and oppress. It is not about giving freedom and liberty to individuals. Similarly, when we look at the violence used in the pirate world, even in the Pirate of Panther Bay, which has been argued by critics, that this is very true to the pirate world. The violence was not something that was actually good. It was actually a fundamental part of the reality, but a key part of what the lead character in the Pirate of Panther Bay is trying to deal with is the question of life and the preservation of life. And in some ways, in many ways, looking at those questions in the context of an environment in which the life itself is threatened becomes a very important tool for making the overall argument that violence is not the answer. Similarly, when we're talking about martial arts and we're talking about a warrior soul, the key for Luke and Lucy is not that you use violence whenever you can. It's a last resort. And sometimes you have to do it because it's the only way that you can create an environment of peace, particularly when you're dealing with an antagonist who is willing to embrace violence in order to suppress and oppress. True bullying in the worst sense of the word. So what happens then, I think in good books, Hunger Games, Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter, the violence and the aggression is actually used as important context. And I believe the ultimate lesson that comes out of those stories is that violence is not the answer. And yes, certainly in my books, you will find, and particularly the Warrior Soul series, each character tries to resolve each one of these situations peacefully. But the reality is, and I think most kids recognize this, is that there are times, a very small number of times, when sometimes you have to come to grips with the reality of violence, whether it's verbal or physical. And I think as authors, one of the things we have to do is show through our stories and our characters ethical ways of addressing violence and aggression, in trying to solve these problems in a way that minimizes the disruption and the violence associated with our world.